Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabardi. Today is Wednesday, June 12th, and today we are going to be looking ahead to tonight's matchup between the Boston Celtics and Dallas Mavericks for their Game 3 matchup. We have an injury update on Kristaps Porzingis where, as things currently stand, he is being listed as questionable. So we're going to break down the little bit of interesting news that has come out there, a quote rare injury that there really isn't much history of in the NBA. So we'll talk about how that could impact his playing status and the overall Celtics game plan moving forward here as they look to close out the Mavericks. We also are going to be diving into some of the comments that Jimmy Butler, not even necessarily just the comments alone, but the little breadcrumbs that he threw out there over the weekend in terms of potentially laying out a desire to leave Miami and some of the various comments that have been made back and forth both with him and Heat President Pat Riley in terms of what his future looks like in Miami. In the final half of the show, we're going to be talking about Paul Skeens, who made his most recent start last night against the St. Louis Cardinals, and he was tremendous once again as he is establishing himself as one of the ace pitchers in the league right now. And then finally, Damian Harris, former running back of the New England Patriots, made some comments about Bill Belichick and the way that he may have played a role in diminishing Mac Jones's development over the course of his tenure with the Patriots. So we are going to dive into all of that. But before we do, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To any of our live viewers, be sure to give us your thoughts on the most late happenings in sports, and we will try and address as many comments as possible and make this show as interactive as possible. And if you would like to become a bigger part of the show, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker. That is gsmcpodcast.net. Your comment will pop up on the screen alongside with a donation for everyone to see. Anything would be greatly appreciated on that front. The Boston Celtics are currently in a situation here where ultimately a 2-0 series lead against the Dallas Mavericks. It seemed like during Game 2 when they had their really poor shooting performance that was sort of the main obstacle that they needed to overcome. We sort of knew that eventually the Celtics were going to have a game like that where their three-point shots weren't falling, and it seemed to be they were riding on this high heading into Dallas with a 2-0 series lead, but that was deflated a little bit with Kristaps Porzingis going down with an injury late in that game, and he ultimately left. It was at first said that it wasn't going to be all that much of a concern. Kristaps Porzingis had the quote that he was ready to die on the court if necessary, and since then we have gotten some interesting updates surrounding this injury where it's being labeled as quote a rare injury. It is some sort of dislocation of sorts, something going on in his left leg. Now, the calf strain that he's been dealing with for the majority of the playoffs up to this point was in his other leg, so it is not the same re-injury, but in large part is being seen as a possible overcompensation with the other leg, and this really brings on doubts as to whether or not he's going to be available for the Celtics moving forward in this series, and even if he does play, what version of himself is he going to be? And this does seem to open up the door a little bit for the Mavericks potentially finding a way back into this series, where it seemed like, again, not that we were ever completely shutting the books on this series. The Mavericks, and specifically Luka Doncic, are too good to do so, but Porzingis, for a week plus, it was talked about that he was going to be the X factor for the Celtics in this series, and he absolutely made his mark through the first couple games. Of course, he had the tremendous first quarter and first half in game one. And overall, he is a plus 25 on the court. The Celtics have won the first two games combined by 25 points. Now, obviously, there's garbage time thrown into that, specifically in game one. But ultimately, if you just take the net rating number itself, the Celtics and Mavericks have been even in the non-Kristaps Porzingis minutes. And now we're not sure, again, especially because we haven't seen this type of an injury in the NBA before, we're not sure what we are going to get. So Joe Mazzulla, the head coach of the Celtics, called it a serious injury, and he came out in the press conference, said he's going to take the decision as to whether or not Porzingis plays out of his hands, because like I mentioned, Porzingis said he was ready to die on the court if necessary, which you have to appreciate the heart from Porzingis, especially where he's dealt with so many injuries throughout the course of his career. That has been really frustrating for him and for the fans of the teams that he's playing for, but the heart is something that should not be questioned right now. And ultimately for the Celtics, I do think that they should, in this situation, err on the more cautious side. Given that, for this series, they have a 2-0 lead right now. They played 10 straight games without Porzingis in the playoffs already so far. They went 9-1 in those matchups. And ultimately, as great as Porzingis is, and again, X factor for the series, it's not like this is some sort of a situation where it's something that is completely new for them. At the end of the day, for as great as Porzingis is, the Celtics have understood that they have to play without Porzingis. And, going back to the regular season where he wasn't playing on back-to-backs and they were very cautious with him. Ultimately, he played 57 games, and it's not like he had too many serious injuries that kept him out for really long spurts of time. I believe there was one at some point in there, but they have been cautious with him all year, meaning they have a lot of experience here playing without him. Now, obviously, they would prefer him to be on the court, but for at least a game here, headed into game 3, I think that they should err on the side of caution. Now, how does that impact the series itself? Well, for starters, the defense when Kristaps Porzingis has been on the court has been absolutely tremendous for the Celtics. We've seen Luka try and go at him a number of times on these switches, but the length that he has just been a real mismatch for both him and Kyrie Irving, and that's when pulling him out on the perimeter, as well as the fact that he has been able to sort of be a little bit of a roamer. The Celtics are putting him on the weaker shooters for Dallas, and he has been able to instead be able to run around the paint a little bit more, and specifically when Luka and Kyrie try and drive off of these pick and roll situations or when they get a blow by, he has been there to meet both of them and send shots the other way. Of course, we've also seen his impact on the transition game as well. The block that he had against Josh Green in that game 1, he's been massively impactful. Also, on the offensive side of the ball, the Celtics have been very 5-out, and that's in large part where the conversation of Jayson Tatum and the function of this offense, obviously shooting splits, and we're going to touch on Tatum very briefly here, but Porzingis has been able to stretch out the defense to extreme lengths, and I believe last game he might have went 0 from the three-point line as well, but in game 1, he was knocking down 25-foot three-pointers, and with his height in particular, you have to be pressed up on him because a late contest is essentially no contest when you're trying to close out on somebody who is 7'2", 7'3". So that is going to be something that's interesting to watch here. We've seen Al Horford play tremendous in this series up to this point, considering the expectations, considering some of his play through the first couple rounds where he was being exposed on the defensive side of the floor. That has not been the case so far at this point, but he has also been able to sit back a little bit more, where Al Horford, when he plays less than 30 minutes is a much more effective version of himself than when he plays over 30. And that's in fact that he is 38 years old. He's older than his own head coach. And, for Horford, he is obviously another massive key here. Are the Mavericks going to respect his three-point shot? Probably not exactly to the same degree as Porzingis, but we saw Horford really struggling for a stretch there in the Eastern Conference bracket where he was being left wide open from three and he wasn't hitting. And ultimately, it led to a lot more contests at the rim. We've already seen the Mavericks try and send a little bit of that extra pressure in the paint from their big men, specifically against the drivers of Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown. And if that is only going to continue to be the case, that will be in a potential issue for the Celtics if Al Horford becomes a non-factor from the three-point line. Now, I don't anticipate that happening. At this point, it feels like the Celtics are, mentally at a point where they are ready to snatch this. But at the same time, Al Horford, again, just turned 38 years old. When you're putting these very heavy minutes on him, it becomes a little bit more problematic. Now, curious to see what the Celtics are going to choose to do in order to make up those Porzingis minutes, whether he's fully healthy or not. If he is at least available, I'm sure Horford probably stretches a little bit beyond the 30-minute mark. If Porzingis doesn't play, I feel like they should lean in the direction of Xavier Tillman. Luke Cornett has been getting the majority of that sort of third big man minutes for the Celtics all season long. I just see him getting absolutely torched in the pick and roll by Luka and Kyrie if he has to play any sort of significant minutes. I just don't think you can run him out there when, you have those pick and roll threats. And especially, you don't want to let Derek Lively, especially, who has been pretty much a non-factor in this series, really start to feel himself a little bit more. But the last point I'll make here is this means that Jayson Tatum has one less star caliber player around him. Maybe you don't consider Porzingis a full star. He's a great player, though, regardless. And again, the fact that he's been coming off of the bench and playing about 20 minutes per game is definitely in favor of the Celtics in terms of adjusting to not having this type of a player. But he has still been an extremely effective offensive player, has helped sort of keep them out of big-time scoring droughts because of his ability to just rise up over defenders along the mid-range and perimeter. And not that he has been going into the paint all too much, but that is at least an option. Tatum now is going to have one less scoring option on the outside. And again, we'll see how the Mavericks choose to play Al Horford. But this is where Tatum is going to need to actually step up from a scoring perspective. Because I believe he's played better than a lot of people are giving him credit for, at least in terms of being the hub of the offense and helping to generate good looks for the Celtics on the games as a whole. But you can't get away with having your best player shoot 32% from the field, 29% from three, and expect to be a juggernaut, which is what the Celtics have been so far in this postseason and on the regular season as a whole. Tatum needs to step up from a scoring perspective. He needs to actually, go at these defenders as opposed to these sort of trying to make these finesse moves at the rim and end up putting up these weak layups. The finishing's got to be better. The overall, 22 shots last game. I would say that ultimately, there weren't too many bad takes, but some of them on the perimeter, some of the, especially late in the game when he's doing this thing that we've seen time and time again of waiting far too long during the shot clock to make a move, force himself into a tough shot. He's got to be more decisive, got to be more aggressive when he is looking to score. Ultimately, I think that his approach is something that the Celtics can continue to live off of, but they're going to need better efficiency from him in this game if they're going to win. Now, Vegas thinks that this is the Mavericks game to take, and they thought that even before Kristaps Porzingis was questionable with this injury, where The line ultimately opened up at the Mavericks favored by 1.5 points. Now that has even shifted another point in the direction of the Mavericks. So they are now 2.5 point favorites. We are going to be discussing whether or not that should be the case, whether or not this is a must-win game for the Mavericks, and previewing tonight's matchup. But before we do so, we're going to be taking a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up in the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, continuing on our conversation about the NBA Finals Game 3 matchup tonight. The Dallas Mavericks have opened and have even seen their odds increase in terms of this Game 3 matchup. So we're going to be previewing this upcoming game like we just talked about in the last segment. Kristaps Porzingis, as things currently stand, is listed as questionable as to whether or not he will be available. Obviously, he has made a massive impact on this series, plus 25 net differential, the offensive scoring, the defensive rim protection, all of it has been a massive part as to why the Celtics have taken this type of a lead. Now, again, don't know whether or not he's going to be playing tonight. Even if he is, we probably won't see heavy minutes for him, probably won't see the exact same version of him. There is a clip of him walking around in the tunnels, and he seems to be pretty healthy, but again, obviously that is a far different conversation as opposed to, sprinting, jumping up and down. And we saw even when he was running the court at the end of that game, after he seemed to tweak his leg, he just did not have the same level of explosiveness. And he's not the number one most explosive athlete necessarily, but at the same time, all of it plays into one another. You can't be a liability on the court in terms of being able to run the floor. So that is sort of what we talked about the other day, that, this Porzingis injury was going to play into the conversation. But even if he doesn't play necessarily, the Mavericks need to be better. There has to be a better level of execution. Now they're going back home. I think that one of the main things you can be optimistic about if you are a Mavericks fan is you have to imagine that the combination of PJ Washington, Derek Jones, if you want to even throw Josh Green in there as well, that the shooting from the three-point line is going to get better. It has been abysmal for them up to this point. Obviously, we know that especially with more inexperienced role players, they play much better at home than they do away. Sort of just a very basic, sports philosophy conversation there. But as much as it's going to absolutely help, and we've seen PJ Washington have games where I wouldn't say single-handedly, but specifically when you look back to that Thunder series in the conference semifinals, he was the one who was really elevating that Mavericks team to another level with the shot creation that was absolutely necessary, because the Thunder were right on the Mavericks' tail just about that entire series. And, even looking back, there are probably Thunder fans out there that feel like they should have won that series, and I wouldn't strongly disagree with that case, but ultimately it was PJ Washington, who is a good player, who hasn't necessarily shown up in exactly the same way. Now, he had a better game 2 performance. He ended up in that game with 17 points. He was 6 of 13 from the field, but again, the 3-point shooting just hasn't been great. And even going back to the Western Conference Finals, we've seen him struggling as of late. Now, one thing that I am sort of curious about as well, it's very clear that outside of Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic, there is very little individual creation from this Mavericks team. I do wonder if that's something that can be rectified a little bit. I've seen PJ Washington, probably mostly so in transition, but even in individual half-court instances, especially when he has smaller defenders on him, be able to drive the lane and get himself good looks at the rim. So I don't know necessarily. Maybe it's with the Celtics because we've seen them play a lot of one-on-one defense throughout this series, which is why we're seeing Luka be able to have these big individual outings, but ultimately the creation for the team as a whole hasn't necessarily been there, because as opposed to the other teams that the Mavericks have faced throughout their postseason run, the Celtics are determined to not let up the corner threes, to let Luka maybe get his individually, but what else is this Mavericks offense going to produce outside of isolation scoring and easy opportunities on the lobs in the corner threes? PJ Washington could make a little bit of a difference here, where the Celtics are a switch everything defense traditionally, meaning especially, and we'll see how that plays out if the Celtics do have to go deeper into their bench in terms of throwing in a big man that hasn't played in a couple rounds because Porzingis may not be available. Maybe that's Xavier Tillman, who I think could probably hold up decent for himself. Maybe we see the Celtics go small ball and run Jayson Tatum at the 5. He's already matching up against Dallas's centers for the majority of these games anyways. So ultimately, putting another ball handler on the floor might be something that the Celtics choose to do, but regardless, that means that Dallas should primarily have the size advantage across the board here. And PJ Washington, I wonder if there are matchups specifically against the likes of a Derek White, who is a tremendous all-world defender, but like any other player that is, 6'3", 6'4", eventually there does come a point where the height becomes a real issue, and I'm not sure necessarily what that is. We haven't seen at all, and definitely if you're Jason Kidd, I understand the risks of also trying to, throw out things that we haven't really seen all year, but I'm curious if there is any sort of a PJ Washington post-up game. Now, again, that's something that just sort of a throwaway comment I'm going to put in there. Could be something that could look as well. Again, the drives themselves are what have been successful, but I'm curious if there's a way to integrate PJ Washington into that offense a little bit more. But I've mentioned all of these different names for the Mavericks. Ultimately, it comes down to the execution of Kyrie Irving, because more so in Boston than at home, it's very, very hard for this Mavericks team to win if Kyrie isn't going to be giving a good enough level on the offensive side of the ball. And we've seen him really struggle up to this point with the inefficiency himself. He's also been, I don't want to fully go calling him a turnstile, but point of attack defense has been miserable for the Mavericks up to this point. And that was a little bit of the concern for the Mavericks coming into, this season, I would say, as a whole. And their defense has done a tremendous job of adapting to maybe some of the personnel shortcomings, you could call it, of not having that elite defense from a guard. Now, Derrick Jones Jr. has been a big part of being able to shut down the likes of Anthony Edwards and, some of these forwards that have been formidable opponents. But ultimately, the Celtics are getting way too many looks on the inside, and Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic are both equally responsible for that. And for at least Luka is being able to go out there and provide that individual scoring. It's not even like he's even set up Kyrie for some opportunities on the perimeter as well, but we see Kyrie currently 0 for 8 from the three-point line in this series. So for him, he needs to step up. Listen, we have been extremely, I don't want to say generous because that makes it sound like Kyrie hasn't earned the respect of the media throughout and the public in general throughout this postseason run. But, we were, again, not me necessarily, but people were calling them the potential best offensive backcourt in NBA history. And now, just 2 games into the series, it is Luka Doncic has no help, which, again, that narrative irks me a little bit, but at the same time, you look at the level of production from what we've gotten in these 2 rounds, Luka has gotten no help offensively. So, again, I'm not necessarily saying I love the narrative, but it is also kind of factual as to what we've seen up to this point, where Kyrie was in conversations with people were saying he was potentially better than both Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown. And he hasn't been a top 5, top 6 maybe even best player in this series. Jrue Holiday has outperformed him. Kristaps Porzingis has outperformed him. You can make maybe a case for Derek White in there as well. And Kyrie's a better player than that. And we understand that in a vacuum, you are taking Kyrie over those 3 names that I just mentioned. The majority of the time, Jrue Holiday has been tremendous in what he provides on both sides of the floor. But we also know that Jrue, when he was asked to be a little bit more of the primary shot creator when he was with Milwaukee, specifically that Miami series last year, he struggled a lot more to help produce great opportunities for himself and his teammates. But he's such a heads-up player, and the fact that he can work into this system of a very talented Celtics team has definitely shown all of the positives that his game brings. But ultimately, Kyrie is not playing to his standards as of right now, and that's absolutely something that he's going to need to do so. This is a must-win game for the Mavericks, where, again, I mentioned they're favored. This is only the 4th time all season long that the Celtics have been underdogs in a game. It happened 3 times during the regular season, all of the occasions on the road. It was versus Sacramento, where the Celtics ended up blowing out the Kings, and then it was those 2 really bad losses on national TV. I believe both of them were on TNT at the time, and the Celtics got killed in both of those instances. So ultimately, we'll see how this all plays out. I believe that the Celtics are going to rest Porzingis. They have the series lead right now. If they lose, then it's at least, they can recover. If they end up winning, then they can, really coast this thing out. And for the Celtics also, they just signed Kristaps Porzingis to a long-term contract as well. They don't want to ruin him for the rest of his career, as much as, yes, this is what you brought him for. And a little, cross-sports reference here, the Red Sox ended up extending Chris Sale to this massive deal, someone who at that point hadn't even had the injury concerns in the past that Porzingis has dealt with. You don't get mad about acquiring the player to win a championship potentially, but then if from there on out the entire contract is plagued with injuries, it's just a bad feeling. And Kristaps Porzingis is going to be a very valuable piece of the Celtics team, not just for this finals, but for as much as everybody has been downplaying how good the Celtics' team has been all year. We are yet to see an NBA champion return to the conference finals in the following season. I believe that it was the Kevin Durant, Steph Curry Warriors, and when they won in 2018, returned to the finals in 2019. That's the last time we've seen a repeat champion put together a conference finals appearance the following season. Porzingis is going to be a massive piece of this Celtics team, where all the top 6 players on the Celtics right now are all under contract at least for next season. So it's a situation where, yes, absolutely, you want to maximize your opportunity at this moment, but Porzingis is not just this, okay, leave it all out on the court right now and thank you for your services. The Celtics see him as somebody who is going to be a part of this roster for years to come as well. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section as to who you have tonight in Game 3 between the Celtics and the Mavericks, and additionally whether or not you think the Celtics should roll the dice on playing Porzingis tonight. But on the note of the basketball and all of the storylines that are surrounding the finals right now, we did get some interesting comments from Jimmy Butler over the weekend as to potentially trying to find a way to Los Angeles this offseason. So we're going to be diving into the backstory from what preceded these comments and why people are making a bigger deal about the situation surrounding Butler and his relationship with the Heat as things currently stand. So we're going to dive into all of that. But first, a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, where we're going to be diving into now the rumors that are surrounding Jimmy Butler and his future with the Miami Heat. This past weekend, he was on the broadcast for an LA Sparks game, the WNBA team located in California, and there is some sort of a relationship. Cameron Brink, the rookie phenom for the Sparks, has mentioned a number of times publicly that she is a massive fan of Jimmy Butler. So Butler went out to support her and the team this past weekend, and he made a comment that really rubbed some people an interesting way, where he said 22 looks good in purple and gold. Now, Jimmy Butler currently wears the number 22 for the Miami Heat, and as much as, yes, so does Cameron Brink for the Sparks, and that is where Butler definitely defaults to in terms of he came out and said, oh, I was just talking about Cameron Brink, and there is a very real chance that he was just showing his support for Cameron Brink. The reality is, I believe he knew what he was doing. In the NBA, we see all of these different sort of subliminal messages that these stars put out there. We've been seeing it for years. LeBron James at the trade deadline this year with the New York Knicks towel, some of the tweets that he put out, the interview where he cut himself off about talking about his teammates, and then followed that up with, I believe it was an hourglass tweet or eyeballs. Again, one of those stupid cryptic messages that we as fans tune into because the NBA stars want us to. Damian Lillard posting videos last offseason of some song about Miami, as he very publicly, him and his agent have talked about how he wants to end up with the Heat. Again, all of these things, they're so stupid, but NBA players know that we are going to be paying attention to these types of things. And Ultimately, Butler makes these comments about 22 looking good in purple and gold. And he sort of comes out a couple days later and says, oh, it wasn't that deep. Sorry, LA fans, or whatever along those lines. But we are at least in a situation right now where, for the first time since Butler came to the Heat in 2019, 2020, I should say, that Butler does seem like he could possibly be available, and the Heat might not be fully committed to him, and that is in large part due to the Pat Riley press conference that he gave at the end of the at the end of the season after the team lost in the playoffs. And part of the speech that he gave was about the fact that Jimmy Butler was not available for the Heat in the playoffs. He obviously got hurt in the play-in tournament at the end of the first quarter there, which does also sort of tie into the conversation that Butler has not been very available for this Heat team in the entirety of his tenure in Miami, where he has played in 58, 52, 57, 64, and 60 games. And at least in these past couple years, the Heat have been a play-in tournament team, and ultimately the fact that they had to play this extra game in the play-in tournament, it was a freak injury that occurred where he just sort of got rolled up on, giving a pump fake in transition, and he just ended up getting steamrolled. But that's a game that Pat Riley at least feels like they shouldn't have even been playing in, that they were better than a play-in tournament team, and that in part due to the fact that Jimmy Butler was not very reliable, missed 22 games of the regular season, plus not to mention the fact that he had probably his worst year in Miami up to this point, where he was just 20.8 points per game. We saw his efficiency not necessarily at the same level that we've seen in the past as well. Actually did shoot 49.9 and 41%. So I'm not saying he was bad by any means, but it's this idea of, are the Heat going to continue to be committed to somebody who is sort of just not somebody who has been taking the regular season very seriously? And again, to some degree, when you talk about Butler and he comes out and says that he cares more about the postseason than he does the regular season and the accolades that come with that, it sounds nice until you have to be an 8 seed in the playoffs, play the number 1 team in the NBA in the first round, and then let alone the fact that he ends up getting injured. And Butler has 2 seasons left on his contract. He's going to be paid $48.8 million this upcoming season, and then he has a player option ahead of 2025-26. So Butler, I would have to imagine one way or another is going to get paid, whether it is by one of these contenders and maybe at a discounted price, or if we're talking one of these, young up and coming teams, who knows, maybe in Orlando. I'm going to keep, digging myself deeper into this hole around the Detroit Pistons, who definitely feel like they are years away, but I do believe in some of the talent that they have on their roster. But again, sort of circling back here to the idea of the Lakers, and would they be willing to make a move for Jimmy Butler in this instance? Ultimately, I think that Butler was just making a comment like that, as much as I'm sure he would like to play for a championship competitive team, to one where he feels like he has more star power around him than he currently has in Miami. The logistics of making this work, again at $48.8 million, does feel a little bit abstract to me, and this is why I don't believe the Lakers are going to be able to get Jimmy Butler this offseason. The Heat would probably ask for a deal in return as well that is probably over what the Lakers are going to be willing to spend. Now, we'll see obviously how the LeBron James free agency situation ends up playing out. I ultimately think he returns to LA for another season, but with all of this, coming into place here, it does seem like we are potentially headed to a splitting up of the Heat and Jimmy Butler, where honestly, for the Heat, I know that there isn't star power necessarily on the rest of that roster, but maybe it's this idea of Heat culture, but more so just having Eric Spoelstra in the building, and whatever the Heat do, whether it's Spoelstra, whether it's Riley, whether it's just the overall staff of these developmental projects, and being able to turn these lesser known players into legitimate guys for their team, that I don't really ever see the Heat, especially when they have a backbone of a all NBA. I don't believe he's made one yet, but Bam Adebayo being, in the realm of an all NBA talent that can provide a backbone for you, where he has not made an all NBA team yet, but a 5-time all defensive player. He's been a 3-time All-Star, including each of the past 2 years, and he's still got a lot of his prime ahead of him, where he's been extremely reliable for them, sort of unlike Butler in that sense, and he has continued to show growths in his game, I would say, at least, where he has expanded his range at least a little bit in the mid-range. Just an extremely heads-up player as well, in terms of, again, making those types of plays that don't necessarily come up on the stat sheet. All of it is just a very interesting conversation, but having him, and again, trusting in what the Heat have from an organizational standpoint, I don't see them ever rebuilding, but could they potentially look to move Jimmy Butler and try and sort of supplement the rest? How much worse than an 8 seed would they really get? And obviously, I know Jimmy Butler raises their ceiling a tremendous amount, but if you're talking about being able to go out and get assets for him, it's something that I'm at least curious in. Now, my prediction is that Jimmy Butler is back with the Heat for next season, and he ends up walking in free agency in headed into the 2025-26 season. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section as to what Jimmy Butler should look to do and what the Miami Heat should look to do. But we're going to be taking our next break here, and when we come back on the other side, we saw another standout performance from pitching phenom Paul Skeens as he continues to light the MLB on fire coming up in his rookie season. We're going to dive into his masterful performance last night against the St. Louis Cardinals. Stick with us. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as now we're going to be shifting gears to the MLB, where we saw Paul Skeens with yet another tremendous performance last night as the Pirates faced off against the St. Louis Cardinals. We got a little bit of an unexpected pitcher's duel, where on the other side, Miles Mikolas ended up putting together a really good line for himself as well. And ultimately, again, it was really interesting to see Skeens, because in his last outing, it was against the Dodgers, and of course it was a test for him against one of the most lethal lineups in the MLB, but the Pirates ended up putting up 7 runs in the second inning, so Skeens was able to maybe be a little bit more defensive, didn't have maybe the same level of pressure on him, where in this game, it was going to be the first one of these players to budge, and ultimately between Skeens and Mikolas, neither one of them did. Both pitched shutout performances. Mikolas had a no-hitter even going on through 6 innings of this game, but ultimately it was the Pirates coming out on top. We'll get into a little bit of that later, but Skeens himself has just continued to dominate through his rookie season, where his final line last night was 6 1/3 innings pitched, 0 earned runs, 8 strikeouts, 5 hits, and 0 walks allowed. This was the longest start of his MLB career up to this point, both in terms of innings pitched with that 1/3 in the 7th inning and pitches thrown. He had previously hit 100 pitches in his second start of the season versus the Cubs. This was the first time that he's pitched into the 7th inning. It was pretty short-lived for the most part. He struck out Nolan Gorman up at the top of the inning, and it's going to be interesting too to see how well his velocity sort of carries through these types of games where high pitch count into the 7th inning. Still got a 97 and 98 mile per hour fastball by Gorman in that strikeout, and then Nolan Arenado ended up taking him for a double next up that ended up putting an end to his night. It wasn't a bad pitch either. It was a 98 mile per hour fastball inside, but Arenado, one of the best hitters in baseball, was able to get a piece of it. And ultimately, at that point, with 103 pitches thrown, the Pirates decided to call it quits. But don't mind them seeing them get a little bit aggressive with Skeens, at least in this type of a situation where he looked tremendous all night. Obviously, we are all just trying to make sure that with all of the pitching injuries that have occurred in the MLB as of late, that this, appointment viewing guy coming up the ranks right now, that he is able to stay together. But he looked great last night. They end up pulling him in that 7th inning. Aroldis Chapman comes in for him and is able to get out of the inning unscathed, and Skeens ends up with that shutout performance. And it was that was a little bit of trouble that he ran into there, at least, that came down to an intense ending there where you could see Skeens nervous in the dugout himself. But the bigger danger situation was for him in the 5th inning, where he had runners on first and third with 0 outs. Him and Michaelis actually both got into these types of situations. It was Skeens in the 5th and it was Michaelis in the 7th, and both of them were able to get out unscathed, and it was just really impressive outings from both of these pitchers. So Skeens ends up getting no decision in this game because it was 0-0 when he left, but the Pirates did win 2-1. It was the 9th inning offense of the Pirates where Ryan Helsley, the closer for the Cardinals, really struggled in this one. It was pretty disastrous, where it was a 4-pitch walk, a single, a 4-pitch walk, bases loaded, just in the span of 10 pitches, and ultimately Pirates got 2 to go in with a couple sacrifice plays that ultimately closed this one out for the Pirates. But we have just seen Skeens be tremendous all season long, so this is really no surprise that we got another great performance from him. Through his 6 starts, he has a 2.43 ERA, 12.4 strikeouts per 9, and a .960 WHIP, which, of course, for those of you who may not be familiar, is the amount of base runners, essentially, per inning, where he has just been absolutely tremendous. And also, when you look at Skeens, it's interesting, being the high velocity guy that he is, we really haven't seen the home run numbers necessarily hurt him quite in the way that you may have anticipated. Now, it's been something that has at least come up, 4 home runs through 33 and a third innings. That is, interesting to see whether or not those numbers ultimately, a lot of these solo shots, it's 1.1 home runs per 9. I think that that's something that he would definitely like to reduce at some point. He's still working in these off-speed pitches as well. When he got, we had seen him as well with the off-speed get hit maybe a little bit harder at times. That's something that he's trying to work into his game still. But obviously, when you talk about Paul Skeens, you were talking about the velocity with him, where Sarah Langs put out a tweet last night that for Skeens, he has pitched 60 pitches 100 miles per hour or greater so far this season, which is the most in the MLB through just his 6 starts. The second most 100 mile per hour pitches thrown by an individual player is Jose Soriano, who has done so 33 times. And Soriano has started 11 games, appeared in 13 total games, pitched 64 and a third innings, which is 31 more innings than Skeens has thrown up to this point, and he has almost doubled Soriano in this little bit of an arbitrary stat, but obviously that's what makes Skeens so exciting, is the numbers just absolutely pop with him, and he's been doing it the entire time so far. So that does lead to the question of, will his body be able to hold up with being this extremely high velocity player throughout the entirety of his career? Like I mentioned, the pitching injuries are basically at an all-time high in the MLB right now, and it's pretty much the number one thing that we are concerned about when we look at the different factors that play in. Velocity is something that has been very heavily linked to this increase in injuries. And Skeens, who is just 22 years old and still isn't, fully developed physically as a person, that he is pushing the limits of what the human body can do. And he's doing so, with extreme velocity, and he has been a very high usage player, even going back to LSU, where you look, 5 of his last 6 starts of his college career were all 100 pitches. In the College Baseball World Series, where he was one of the main reasons LSU was able to go on and win the national championship, and every single one of those starts, he threw over 100 pitches, and in 3 of the 4 starts, he threw over 120 pitches, all while still continuing this high velocity arsenal as well. So it's something to consider, at least. Ultimately, I feel like the Pirates are in a really good position right now, where they're in the mix in terms of the division and potentially being in the wild card. They're 6.5 games back of the Brewers, who are a team that don't feel like this untouchable monster in the NL Central. They are neck and neck right now for the last wild card position as well, despite the fact that they are sub 500. But they have all this promise, and they're in the mix, and they can be competitive, but ultimately it doesn't feel like they are a true contender just yet, which is almost the best possible position for Skeens to be in, where he's playing meaningful baseball, but at the same time, the Pirates, and this is where it's going to be on the organization to make sure that you take care of your guy, that ultimately they don't overtax Skeens and end up running into trouble there. There is no reason to rush him into anything. And obviously, there are conversations being had right now, and I know that a lot of baseball fans are defensive of it, and we are, I would say, as sports fans, a lot of the times we are a little bit hesitant to, give out these big titles and such, but Skeens has at least pitched like one of the best pitchers in the league right now, and obviously there is going to be an adjustment period where professional hitters end up learning more about him, maybe finding some cues to tee off of, but we have known that Skeens, the talent, was going to be a tremendous player for years now, and it is really encouraging that we see someone like him, emerge onto the scene almost immediately so far, and it's just going to be interesting to see how this plays out with him. Again, fingers crossed that everything works out for him, but he is in a pretty loaded rotation. Again, I know the Pirates aren't even 500 right now, but between him, Jared Jones, and Mitch Keller, there is a very bright future from the Pirates rotation. So Skeens, again, I've been calling him appointment viewing since he was called up to the MLB, and he has been able to live up to that type of a title so far. But we are going to be taking our final break of the show here, and when we come back on the other side, there were some comments made from former Patriots running back Damian Harris regarding Bill Belichick and how he may have hurt Mac Jones throughout the development process of the former first round pick. So we are going to be diving into what Harris said and whether or not he was justified in his comments. But first, our final break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where we're going to be diving into the comments that Damian Harris made about his former head coach Bill Belichick and the role that Belichick played in, from Harris's perspective, the demise of Mac Jones. So Harris the other day went on the Athletic Football Show podcast, and he was asked about Bill Belichick, and he ultimately blamed Bill for the struggles that Mac Jones went through throughout the final part of his tenure in New England. He referenced the fact that Mac Jones was a Pro Bowl quarterback his rookie season. He was an alternate to that point, but ultimately he did put together a very solid season, 3,800 yards, 22 touchdowns. He looked like a much more confident version of himself, and no, he wasn't necessarily making these massively dynamic plays, making these great throws, but he was sort of what a lot of us expected him to be in the NFL, which was a little bit of a game manager. I think that the comp for him that I liked the most sort of for Mac Jones coming into the NFL is that he could be a Kirk Cousins type of, again, just being a very solid quarterback that you're not going to lose because of, where I know some people don't necessarily feel the same way about Kirk Cousins, but he can win you games. And the Patriots ended up winning 10 games, and they ultimately got blown out by the Buffalo Bills in the playoffs. Mac wasn't even bad necessarily in that game, but the Patriots were just entirely outclassed by the Bills in that season, and the future seemed to be really bright for Mac Jones. But that's where Harris said that things sort of started to turn for Mac Jones, and he was put in a difficult position where Harris talked about the frustrations of Belichick hiring Matt Patricia as the replacement offensive coordinator after Josh McDaniels left that offseason to take the head coach job for the Raiders. And that inexperience, it was sort of mind-boggling to everybody really at the time, of bringing in somebody who just isn't an offensive mind at all and putting him in that position. And it felt like it was because of the familiar face for Belichick, where we saw, especially at the end of his tenure as a head coach and general manager, in New England that he really preferred to surround himself with familiar faces and people that he has worked with in the past. And that's what he did, bringing in Joe Judge and Matt Patricia. And from there, things got really ugly for the Patriots. And from Harris's perspective, he thought that Bill Belichick had sort of told Matt Patricia that, quote, these are Harris's words, as long as you teach him what I say, everything will be fine. And obviously everything was not fine in New England. They had 2 miserable seasons from an offensive perspective, and ultimately Matt Patricia, he ends up being fired from the position after the 2022 season, and in comes 2023, where you can't blame Matt Patricia any longer. And there are some numbers in which the 22 offense was better than 23. But again, at least this is my own thoughts as opposed to what Damian Harris was saying, that Belichick almost took it out of spite, it felt like, at least in my eyes, chose to not give Mac Jones any extra talent on the offensive end. Mac was almost rebellious, outspoken against the situation that he was put into, specifically from a coaching perspective. And Belichick, for a defense that was already pretty good in New England, he spends no first round picks on any type of skill players. The first 3 for the all of the picks in the first 3 rounds for the Patriots in last year's draft were on defensive players, which, not bad. Christian Gonzalez was a steal. We saw Keon White flash some potential as well. I'm not saying they're bad picks necessarily, but the Patriots, the conversation over the past couple years is they need a lot of help on the offensive end. And Belichick, who hasn't had a great reputation in terms of being able to draft skill position players, maybe that was it, is he was just sticking to what he knows he's good at, possibly, but he was blatantly ignoring the holes that were on this Patriots offense. And obviously we saw by the end, Mac Jones, listen, it sounds like I'm making a lot of excuses for him. He was a disaster by his final season in New England, where I don't know if there was a team in the NFL that had worse quarterback play than what the Patriots got with Mac Jones and Bailey Zappi. Now, Jets fans probably to some degree want to have a conversation there with the entire situation that played out after Aaron Rodgers went down with an injury, but it just ultimately, last year was a disaster. And from my perspective, it was clear that Mac Jones mentally was just sort of broken, where he was seeing ghosts. The offensive line was horrendous. For 2 straight years, it was horrible. And I think that Mac Jones just became extremely uncomfortable with pressure, that it was just so easy for opposing defenses to get to him, where it seemed like sometimes Mac Jones was trying to stick it out too much and end up making the hero ball play, and that almost turned into, the second he felt any pressure, he decided, okay, I got to get rid of this, and the offense was just non-existent for a lot of the season. So he ultimately gets benched. Bailey Zappi takes over, who is no better. But I think there is a real argument to Belichick really hurting the developmental process of Mac Jones. And to Damian Harris's comments, he said that Bill Belichick needs to be in control of everything. Obviously, not coincidentally, that is the same sentiment that other teams that had coaching vacancies this past offseason also felt like with Belichick, that they weren't ready to give up the amount of control that they at least anticipated that he would want. And Harris said that he absolutely has a right to do so, given the fact that Belichick has his resume of winning 5 Super Bowls as a head coach, another couple as a defensive coordinator. The guy obviously knows football and knows what it takes to win football games, second all time in wins. But ultimately, the game It's an interesting conversation as to whether or not the game passed by Bill Belichick. I still believe he is an excellent defensive mind, but I feel like, especially as the years went on, and especially after Tom Brady ended up winning a Super Bowl without him, his ego became a lot more fragile. And obviously, I myself am a Patriots fan. I will forever be grateful to Belichick for what he did over the years, but Belichick's philosophy as a general manager was always, we're not paying you for what you've done in the past, it's for what we are getting out of you now. And that's just sort of the situation that Belichick fell into, where he was sort of living off of his past reputation. If any other general manager hired Matt Patricia as their offensive coordinator, they would have been fired by week 6. But it was, oh, well, I guess we have to trust Bill because he has taken the Patriots to numerous Super Bowls, and ultimately it just fell so flat. And ultimately, it's very rare that we see great things come to a storybook ending, where even when you look at Peyton Manning, who is, leaving while on top. Well, Peyton Manning was also benched during that season for Brock Osweiler, and he was the starting quarterback for the Super Bowl. So that at least makes it, you can sort of gift wrap what happened in that light, but ultimately he was carried by one of the best defenses of the 2000s, and that Broncos defense led by Von Miller that was able to get the job done ultimately, and a pretty good rush attack as well, for as crazy as it sounds, knowing that CJ Anderson was the lead guy there. And I'm getting off on a whole different tangent here, but it's rare. We see what's going on with the Warriors dynasty right now in the NBA and how ugly it's looked, and especially in these past couple years. You just don't get fairy tale endings for a lot of these great things, and I'm curious whether or not Belichick is ever going to get another opportunity in the NFL. There's a chance that next year there are some organizations, specifically you look at the Eagles and the Bills and maybe the Cowboys, and these teams that feel like they are Super Bowl competitive but have at least some question marks at quarterback, or at head coach, I should say. And ultimately, I think it might be the end for Belichick already. After going unsigned this offseason. Now, maybe again, if you are one of these other teams that feel like you are right on the doorstep of winning, your head coach is the one thing that's holding you back, sign Belichick for 2-3 years and call it quits from there. But I don't know necessarily. It is seeming like it's the end of Belichick, and again, you have to appreciate the career that he put together. And even still, to this situation of what went down with Mac Jones, I mean, Mac Jones just was not good enough. But when you look at the way that Belichick treated this situation with Mac, it's hard to imagine that he's going to be somebody you can trust to develop young talent like that, especially at the quarterback position, after growing maybe a little bit of a mental callus with Tom Brady, who could do everything he needed of him, and there wasn't really necessarily too much of a coaching need from that perspective, especially in the latter part of Brady's tenure with the Patriots. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section. That is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Be sure to check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content. We are live here on the GSMC Sports Podcast every 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. So we will be back tomorrow with some reactions from the Game 3 matchup tonight. Have a great day. We will see you tomorrow. Take care.
Let's go. I wake
wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great.